Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Behavioral Insights Group webinar. My name is Sam, and I'm a member of the Behavioral Insights Student Group. And we're just going to give everyone a minute to join, and then we'll begin the webinar. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started with today's Behavioral Insights Group webinar. Today, we have Mina Cikara and Vicky Fouka joining us to speak about how hate crime increases with minoritized group rank. I am pleased to introduce Mina Cikara, who is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Harvard University. She received her PhD in psychology and social policy from Princeton University and completed an NIH Ruth Kirstein National Research Service Award postdoctoral fellowship in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences at MIT. Professor Cikara studies how the mind, brain, and behavior change when the social context shifts from me and you to us and them. She primarily focuses on how group membership, threat, and prejudice disrupt the processes that allow people to see others as human and to understand one another. She's equally interested in how the behavioral consequences of these processes breaking down discrimination, conflict, and harm. Additionally, I would like to introduce Vicky Fouka as an assistant professor of the political science at Stanford University and a research affiliate at the Center for Economic Policy Research. Her main research is focused on group identity and in-group, out-group relations. She studies the conditions under which minority members identify with and are accepted by a majority, and the implications of that for how to design policies and institutions. She also looks at major applications of her research, including migrant assimilation, the determinants of prejudice against ethnic and racial minorities, and the long-run effects of history for intergroup relations. We're really excited for them to join us today, and we look forward to hearing them present on hate crime.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Samantha. I really appreciate that introduction. And of course, I also want to thank the Behavioral Insights Group so much for this opportunity to share this work. Vicky has very generously allowed me to commandeer the first bit of the presentation or the discussion to just sort of lay the groundwork for this project and even give you a little bit of background about where I came from approaching this. And I'd love, Vicky, for you also to give that when we're through presenting this. But so with that, I guess I'll just start. So Samantha did a great job summarizing what it is that I research more generally. And so I guess I'll just kick off by saying that social groups are woven very tightly into the fabric of our lives. They shape how we perceive, punish, cooperate with, and learn from other individuals. But the problem is that I think that the dominant model of studying and seeking to understand intergroup dynamics, at least within some arms of the social sciences, has actually got it turned the wrong way around. Maybe we've been thinking about it a little bit backwards. So before I launch into the specific project that Vicky and I had collaborated on, along with Marco Tabellini, our collaborator, I just wanted to give you a little bit of where I'm coming from and how I've been thinking about this. So driven in part by the prominence of something called social identity theory and the minimal groups paradigm, I'm sure most of you have heard some version of this. This is the idea that you can get people to exhibit social biases even when you just randomly assign them to teams. So you're on team A, you're on team B. Suddenly, which team you're on determines who you trust more, to whom you allocate more resources, and so on. As a result of the influence of these demonstrations and theories, the contemporary intergroup literature has really emphasized the role of explicit category membership. So let's say Black versus white people, Red Sox versus Yankees fans, US versus Russians, so on and so forth, in predicting intergroup attitudes and behavior. But what I want to argue is that this approach is limited because social categories aren't fixed, homogeneous entities, right? So for one, the associations with specific categories change over time, as Vicky and Marco have demonstrated in their previous work when Italian and Irish immigrants became white in America in the early 20th century by assimilating into native white communities. Of course, allegiances between categories can also change. So you can just compare Americans' relationships to Germans now versus, let's say, 80 years ago, which naturally changes the nature of attitudes and behavior that unfold in these intergroup contexts. And third, Not all categories carry with them the sort of psychological potency of purposive groups. So, you know, even though brunettes constitute a category, we've never been concerned about an uprising of brunettes. Now, furthermore, the studies that are based on social categories make it difficult to infer from them anything about generalized group processes. For example, some, but not all, social categories are intrinsically confounded with differences in visual appearance of the targets. Many groups carry with them specific stereotypes and associated prejudices. Perceivers' familiarity with the groups in question will vary, and so on and so on. So in short, I don't know, for example, what aspects of an interracial interaction will carry over into an interpolitical party interaction. Now, finally, the category-based approach is limited because it's context insensitive, right? It breaks down as agents' goals shift or as agents' other intersecting identities become salient. So consider, for as examples, the adage, not all skin folk are kinfolk, or widespread confusion as to how so many Hispanic and Latinx voters supported Trump in the 2020 election. Research treating demographic categories as purposive groups will often run into these explanatory limitations and may ironically end up reinforcing stereotypes and beliefs that these categories are social monoliths. So studying explicit categories is unlikely to get us very far in the pursuit of understanding the general concept of groups. So here's the puzzle. And this is the puzzle that I've been obsessed with. What are these alternative cues to social group structure that are less subject to these limitations? So I'm going to start here, which may seem like a funny place to start, but my approach more generally and specifically in collaborating with Vicky and Marco and bringing together all of the threads and the backgrounds that we share is to draw on research from psychophysics and decision making to generate different models of social group attitude change that start here. So perhaps some of you are familiar with this. This is the Ebbinghaus visual illusion. And when you look at the orange dots, you can't help but see the one on the right is larger. However, when I remove the blue dots or the context around the dots, it's very clear that they're the same size. This is a bit of a hacky analogy, but it illustrates a fundamental tenet of our psychology, which is that context matters. And this is true for judgments of all kinds, ranging from psychophysics to social cognition. And so the paper that I'm presenting today and that Vicky and I will be sharing with all of you and really looking forward to your feedback. This is Vicky Fouka here, and then our collaborator, Marco Tabolini, who's over at HBS. This is the focus of the work we're going to be doing here, specifically as it applies to shifting demographics and hate crimes. But before I get there, I just want to give us a little bit of context for context dependence, which is that classic rational theories of choice dictate that decision makers' preferences between any two options should remain the same, irrespective of the number or the quality of alternatives. This axiom is known as the independence of irrelevant alternatives. And yet humans, monkeys, birds, even insects reliably violate this axiom. So what does it mean that the way we think about any option in a choice shift set will shift as a function of what choices are available for social group attitudes and behavior? That is, what does it mean for social groups, particularly in a time of great demographic change? Now, the confluence of global political and economic upheaval with humanitarian and climate crises has immigrants and refugees on the move in absolutely unprecedented numbers. Now, the bulk of research on the effects of these changes has examined how increased mobility impacts host country majority group members' feelings about newcomers in particular, and their racial attitudes and policy preferences more generally. Now, one prevailing framework argues that there are specific characteristics of migrant, refugee, and resident minority groups that drive people's responses to them. So their presumed skill, their perceived foreignness, their competitiveness and status, many different features. And the notion is that these features are what are guiding majority group members' responses towards these new groups. But an alternative is that majority group members are sensitive to a more generalized group feature that signals threat, invariant to the groups in question. Now, note that in this presentation, I'm going to continue to rely on the notion of racial and ethnic categories to define groups. I hope that we can convince you that this work is pushing us more towards a feature-centric rather than a category-centric way of thinking about conflict. Okay, so one such threat feature that has garnered a great deal of attention, particularly with increases in shifting demographics, is group size. Basically, the larger the groups become, the less well they are liked. But this relationship is not so straightforward. The first problem is that people's beliefs may not reflect demographic reality. For example, people reliably overestimate the size of immigrant populations in the US. A further complication is that size judgments of individual objects, of collectives, they are reference dependent. And this gets us back to that visual illusion. That is, one's estimate of the size of a target will always be determined relative to other accessible targets, whether that comes from a choice set that's presented exogenously or if it's sampled from memory endogenously. So it's not necessarily the case that new group growth will trigger threat. So new groups may have to surpass, for example, a certain threshold in size to register as a threat. But then the question becomes, what is that threshold, right? And also that because immigrants, refugees, and resident minority groups are not distributed evenly geographically, then different communities should exhibit distinct hierarchies of prejudice across different minority groups. So importing the concept of reference dependence as a driver of intergroup attitudes and behavior can help us get some more traction on how it is that group relations will change over time, but also vary across social ecologies. So the idea here is that relying on the concept of reference dependence as a driver can help us get what I just said, better traction, both over space and over time. So what we want to present here is the social group reference dependence hypothesis, which is basically the idea that majority group members' reactions to any one group is going to depend on what other groups are also around. And here we're going to test a specific corollary of that general hypothesis, which is that rather than being sensitive to the absolute size of any one minority group, instead communities are going to be sensitive to minority groups' relative rank in size, specifically being most discriminating against whichever group represents the largest local minority, and then the second place, and then the third place, and the fourth place, and so on. So as demographics shift and groups change in relative size, discriminatory behavior and attitudes towards them should change accordingly. So how did we test this? Well, our first test case is in the domain of hate crimes. So we tested the social group reference dependence hypothesis in the context specifically of the United States. And we focus on the current majority group, which is white people's treatment of attitudes towards 4 racial/ethnic groups. That is Black, Hispanic/Latinx, Asian, and Arab people. And we use data from the US Census of Population between 1990 and 2010 to measure the size of those groups as a share of total population, as well as their rank relative to one another as at the county level. So to examine discriminatory behavior against each of these minority groups, we use data on hate crimes compiled by the FBI as part of the Uniform Crime Reporting Program. Now, this data set is really cool because it records the bias motivation of each crime. For example, it could be listed, it could be listed accompanied by the descriptor, it's anti-Black, as well as the race of the perpetrator. So our first dependent variable is the number of hate crimes committed by white offenders against a given group in a given county and decade, expressed as the fraction of the county's total population. So let's say hate crimes per 100,000 inhabitants. We combine these two data sources to create a novel county, group, decade specific data set. And then we study the relationship between hate crimes against a specific racial and ethnic group and that group's size-based rank in a county in a given decade. Now, we also look at the effects of rank on self-reported attitudes towards 3 of the 4 groups, though in the interest of time, I'm not going to dig into those results in detail. Okay, but we're happy to answer questions about them during the Q&A. So the first thing we wanted to see descriptively was whether there was any relationship between a group's rank as also above and beyond its share of all minorities, as well as the likelihood that someone from that group is targeted with a hate crime again, where it's hate crimes per 100,000 inhabitants in that county. So what we see here, it shows how hate crimes against a racial ethnic group vary with that group's share of all minorities in a county, and whether that group is the largest, so the first ranked group, or the second largest, the second ranked group, in blue and red respectively. So here we have, for example, hate crimes specifically targeting Hispanic and Latinx people. And the question is, for example, where the red dots and the blue dots overlap, that is where Hispanic and Latinx people represent the same share of all minorities in a given county, whether just being in first place rank-wise increases the likelihood that they're targeted with a hate crime. And what we find is that it's apparent for Hispanic groups of any relative size, and it becomes increasingly clear for Asian people as their relative size increases, and for Black people as their relative size increases. But these relationships may be spurious. For example, Hispanic and Latinx people are the largest minority in most Southwestern states and counties. And so persistent negative views of that group or in that region, or proximity to the border with Mexico, could be driving white people's propensity to target that group with hate crimes. If these factors were the only ones contributing to anti-Hispanic behavior, the Hispanic Latinx group rank in the minority size distribution within a given county should have no effect. So to address this and similar other potential confounders, we used a fixed effect analysis. So this analysis accounts for any county-specific factor, observable and unobservable, that could affect the frequency of hate crimes and that does not vary over time. And so this includes a county's persistent levels of outgroup intolerance or any other characteristics that could correlate with it, such as geographic location or economic conditions. We also account for time invariant factors specific to each minoritized group that are common across all counties. So for example, the fact that it is the case that higher average levels of prejudice, that we observe higher levels average of prejudice against Hispanic, Latinx, and Black people compared to Asians in the country as a whole. Finally, we net out decade-specific shocks that could change community members' behaviors towards minoritized groups in general. So that could be economic shocks that might increase scapegoating across all minoritized groups. And crucially, we always control for the size of each minoritized group, thereby isolating the effect of rank from a more general size effect that's been identified in the previous literature. So all of these analyses are always looking for an effect of rank above and beyond just how big the group is. Okay, so just to get to some initial data, this figure plots coefficient estimates and 90% confidence intervals of the marginal effective size rank on hate crimes, controlling for all those other fixed effects that we just discussed for 100K county residents committed by white offenders. And what we see here is that conditional on a minoritized group size, that group's rank is highly predictive of its victimization rate. So a group experiences 1.5 more hate crimes per 100K county residents when it moves from fourth place to first place in the size rank distribution of that county. This effect corresponds to 167% of the average county level victimization rate of a group across the 3 decades that we analyze. Now, the second and the third largest are also in higher danger of victimization relative to the fourth. And the first is higher than the second, but the difference between the second and the third is not statistically significant. Of course, there could be other explanations for these results, right? So we probed the robustness of the result in a number of ways. First, we find that the rank effect does not merely capture rising prejudice against groups that are growing over time throughout the entire country. So it's not the case that this effect is driven by only specifically, for example, Hispanic Latinx group growth in the US between 1990 and 2010. Nor does rank capture changing characteristics of counties over time. So that could be varying economic conditions that could increase scapegoating towards the county's largest minority. Second, or third, our findings are not an artifact of the nonlinear effects of relative group size. We also find that rank remains predictive of groups' victimization rates independent of whether we measure their size relative as a share of the total population or just specifically as the share of the minoritized population. Next, the effect of rank is robust to controlling to the relative group sizes of all other minoritized groups and for the difference in relative size between a minoritized group and the group immediately below it in rank. Finally, it doesn't capture just faster growing, that is the rate at which groups grow in some counties. In fact, our effects remain robust to controlling for the county-specific growth rate of each minoritized group size. We also find that group size rank displays a relatively consistent effect across different geographic subsamples. So our results do not vary by macro region. The largest minority is more likely to be victimized across all US macro regions. And this is defined following the US Census classification, though I should note that the effect is somewhat weaker in the Northeast. And finally, examining a smaller unit of regional analysis, the effective rank does not depend on the distribution of minoritized groups within the county. So the largest minority within a county is equally likely to be victimized in counties with high versus low racial and ethnic diversity. Now, a remaining potential concern is that even the estimates from our fixed effects models could be influenced by the fact that both hate crimes toward a particular racial or ethnic group and that group's rank in a county's minority size distribution are simultaneously related to a third factor that we haven't accounted for. For instance, even accounting for a county's location in the US South, counties with a stronger legacy of slavery as compared to those with lower past dependence on enslaved persons' labor, within that regions are going to be more biased against Black people today. But it just so happens in those counties, Black people have consistently remained the largest minority group. It's also possible that large minority populations have specific characteristics that trigger more discriminatory behavior from white perpetrators. So for example, Hispanic and Asian people may be less likely to speak English or more likely to be geographically concentrated in counties where they are the largest group, thereby activating greater threat responses among the local white population. So to address these and similar possibilities, we exploit the fact that groups experience changes in their rank in the same county over time. For example, between 1990 and 2010, Hispanic Latinx groups rose in rank on average, while other minoritized groups' relative ranks fell. And what I'm showing you here is the frequency in changes of ranks by different racial and ethnic category across the nation on average. So this is across the entire US as a whole. But this average pattern masks really wide variation, both in terms of the direction of the rank changes, as well as the geographical distribution of said rank changes. That is, if you plot it, you can see that there are rank switches where groups are going up, like Hispanic groups may actually be dropping, whereas on average, they tend to be increasing in rank across most counties, and vice versa for all of the different groups under consideration. So exploiting variation in rank switches across groups, we estimate the effective rank by only comparing victimizations rate within group county cells. So just to give you more of an intuition of what that's doing, this strategy compares the change in victimization suffered by two minority groups whose relative size in a given decade grows by the same amount, but who experience a different change in rank. So for example, in one case, not changing rank despite having grown, versus in county B, having increased in rank by one slot. Now, these red dots are the data that you've already seen from the fixed effects model. The blue dots show that even in this case of just isolating our analysis to rank switches, we find that rank continues to predict the frequency of group-specific hate crimes. So holding the change in relative size across 2 decades constant, moving from last to first predicts that a minoritized group will experience an increase in the frequency of hate crimes that target it equal to approximately 64% of the average victimization rate across counties and decades. So again, this effect is robust to accounting for time trends in groups and counties' characteristics, minoritized groups' growth patterns, as well as a number of ways of controlling or conditioning on the effect of relative group size. So just to summarize, what we find is that an increase in group size-based rank relative to other minoritized groups was associated with higher likelihood of being targeted with hate crimes and more negative attitudes invariant to the groups in question. Now, one thing you may be wondering is why are individuals sensitive to group size rank when they're so inaccurate in judging minority groups' absolute size or even proportions in the population? And it turns out this is where my background, for example, in decision making informs our inferences here a little bit. These rank transformations of distribution information represent a form of efficient coding that's present across many different domains of decision making. So we speculate that people begin potentially from the premise that they have finite resources with which to defend their groups and their group status. And this generates a rank ordering of threat from greatest to least urgency. Now, in principle, people could maintain staunchly negative attitudes and behavior towards all possible outgroups in their environment as new outgroups arrive or grow. But they would, in practice, end up entirely surrounded by competitors or enemies. So, the strategy then is to infer new groupings, that is, to become relatively more inclusive toward less threatening outgroups. For example, as Marco and Vicky have shown, native born white people did towards Irish and Italian immigrants in response to increased settlements of Southern born Black people during the Great Migration. Now, our framework also makes novel predictions about how demographic shifts may contribute or may affect coalitional structures in the years to come. For instance, Asian Americans continue to be the country's fastest growing racial category in the US, with immigration being a major driver of this growth. So as Hispanic and Asian populations continue to grow, those counties with the greatest relative increases in these populations may experience a change over the features that matter for prejudice. For example, shifting away from skin tone to language as a primary coalitional boundary. Relatedly, Asian Americans' tenuous status as model minorities may wane as their populations increase, specifically in those places where they begin to outnumber other minoritized groups and specifically increase in rank. Now, a broader theoretical contribution of this framework and the current findings is that they dispel the notion that attitudes and behavior towards social categories are fixed or somehow derived exclusively from categories' essentialized properties, that there's something special about these categories or these people, or some kernel of truth to the stereotypes that elicits these kinds of responses from other people. And this matters because majority group members' beliefs about the malleability of race-based bias and discrimination influence their approaches to and strategies with interracial interactions. For example, some other work from Jadessa Shapiro and colleagues has found that those people who are led to believe that bias is malleable, the way that we see it is in our data, those people prefer to learn why interracial interactions are challenging, as opposed to people who just seek to end the interaction as quickly as possible. So the more that people understand when and why prejudice and discrimination are flexibly deployed, perhaps the more empowered they may feel to combat it. So with that, I just want to shout out one of my funding sources, provide you with a link to the paper. This QR code, if you take out your phone and snap a photo of it, will also link you straight to the paper. So I'll leave it up for just a couple more seconds. And with that, I would just like to invite Vicky to weigh in and fix anything that I might have misrepresented in the course of our paper. So with that, thanks so much.
I think you've accurately represented everything, and thanks very much for presenting our project. The only thing that I would say on my side and how I came to this, it's exciting for me for two reasons. The first one is that my work has mostly focused on minority groups and immigrants and how they respond to exclusion or prejudice. And so their strategies for dealing with that and how that affects their integration. So this is a way for me to kind of examine the other side, prejudice of the majority against minorities, and sort of put the two things together for understanding social cohesion more broadly. And then the second reason is that this is a very interdisciplinary project and we come to it from very different backgrounds. I am trained in economics and I'm in a political science department. Many of the issues that I am dealing with or the questions I'm interested in my work touch on, you know, a lot of work from social psychology that I knew more superficially. So it was a great entryway for me to collaborate with Mina on this project and learn more things firsthand. So I guess it's up to you guys now. If you have questions, we're happy to discuss them. what type of policy interventions would they suggest to be implemented to reduce this negative outcome? I don't know, we haven't gotten that far yet.
Yeah, I mean, potentially. So one thing that's come up when we've had a chance to talk about this project with other audiences is the question of whether or not what really is driving, sort of what's driving this. And, right now we don't have particularly compelling evidence to nail down a mechanism here. So for example, folks have asked before, well, is it real demographic change and rank shifts, or is it just the perceptions of these things that could be driving these kinds of reactions in the community, in the broader communities? And so, I mean, the first thing that we've talked about is that, well, of course, something would have to be perceived for there to be a behavioral shift, right? The question is, what is it exactly? Is it direct observation of these rank switches, or is there some sort of proxy cue or something that's correlated to which people potentially are very sensitive? And we've batted about, just anecdotally, things like, well, maybe it's when specific cultural touchstones arise. So let's say the introduction of, like restaurants that are specific to a particular group. Or, I mean, the example that I tend to give in Q&As is I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, and which is a relatively diverse area in general, just in LA County. And there was a reaction to a particular structure being erected, and what it was a Korean megachurch. And the community, or at least there was some discussion in the community, in part because what ended up happening was that people sort of scratched their heads and said, wait a second, there are that many Korean people who live that nearby, enough to, require a church, nay, a mega church. And so it's possible that when there are cultural touchstones or institutions that sort of are required to serve a large enough community, that those things then bring attention to these kinds of rank switches. But that's definitely a huge step for our next, or that's our next step in the project, right? Is trying to better suss out precisely what is it that people are responding to that is reflected as a function of these rank switches. So once we get that nailed down, then maybe we would be in a better position to think about how to attenuate, or to at least be able to shift perceptions with respect to those cues. But I think we're getting perhaps a bit ahead of ourselves for policy interventions to reduce this particular negative outcome.
I'd also say it is maybe particularly difficult in this context and in general with context dependence, because there seems to be something that is a little bit zero sum, like a group rises in rank and attracts more prejudice and more violent behavior. This also means that another group drops in rank and attracts less prejudice and less violent behavior. So to some extent, maybe there is like, it would be consistent with like a fixed amount of prejudice being out there and redirected to groups depending on where they stand in rank. So maybe the way to think about it is, there's one positive side of this, which is going down, dropping in rank is good for some groups. And then we can focus on mitigating the negative effects for the groups that rise in rank. We don't have a concrete suggestion as to what that could be, but maybe a direction to think in.
Yeah, that's I hadn't thought about it exactly that way, but that's brilliant. And it's sort of, I mean, it's implied, it's certainly what you observed, Vicky, in your past work on how it is that assimilation for Irish and Italian immigrants increased with inflows of Southern Black people who were moving due to as part of the Great Migration. So that's exactly the idea. Is yeah. So there is a sense in which, it's hard to know what's driving the hate crimes effect. Like it could just be a drop for this case as compared to like the lower ranked groups, that is it as much as it is an increase in hate crimes specifically targeting the first ranked group. And I'm not entirely sure how we pull that apart, but.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, I I don't even know if it is possible and that all of this is happening simultaneously. So maybe the way to think about it is as a reallocation of resources. Like if you are to, put in that much effort to reduce prejudice, then thinking about how to target that to groups that might be more or less affected might be a way to think about, policy recommendations concretely. This is just a speculation, but just based on how we would interpret these results.
Yeah. We have another question. Do you have confidence that the observed behavior is characteristic of majority populations versus a characteristic of American white majority populations? Oh, that's a really good one.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to say, given that this is our data and this is the case that we're studying. So we find this effect for this particular population. Ideally, to be able to answer this question, with confidence, we would have to replicate this in a different country, a different context, with a different majority and different definitions of groups. So I don't know, it's a question of external validity that is there for every study.
Yeah. Which is to say that if anyone has any tips on data sets in other contexts, times, places, what have you, we're all ears, because it would be, not easy, but it would be fairly straightforward to try to adapt this analysis for those other times and places and groups. It is worth noting that the idea of group size-based threat is an old idea in the social sciences. But one of the reasons that we got excited about specifically looking at rank above and beyond group size is because there seemed to be somewhat inconsistent results in the group threat theory literature. That is to say that sometimes, depending on how new groups are defined, let's say if you study immigrant inflows in Western European countries, sometimes you observe that larger sizes elicit greater prejudice, but in other cases there are null results. So, and I'm happy to, the preprint actually has citations that are sort of both in support of or comport with the group threat, just a size-based prediction, versus those that find a null effect of size. So, one possibility is that having accounted for rank above and beyond size, maybe that can help to explain why it seems like this effect may be inconsistent in previous investigations. And another thing may be that folks may be looking at the question at too grand a scale. So providing people with, say, percentages of immigrants at the level of the nation may not do much to foment threat if your local ecology hasn't really changed, right? So that's another thing that sets this analysis apart from some of the previous literature, is the granularity of the analysis. It's not at the level of country or state, it's really at the level of county. And Vicky just recently shared with me some pretty compelling meta-analysis to suggest that these sort of like psychological effects tend to operate on these smaller scales because they're part and parcel of people's day-to-day experiences, which is not to say that, political leadership and rhetoric can't affect people's threat perceptions. Of course, that kind of messaging also works, as we've seen in the last 5 years. But just that it could be that these more direct experiences have an equal hand in shaping people's perceptions and then downstream attitudes and behaviors.
In terms of generalizing this to other contexts, just to say that the big advantage of this empirical setup is what Mina mentions, the granularity and the fact that we can get the exact same information for a number of different groups, and for a long period of time, which is something generally difficult to find in other contexts. And even in the US, if you want to measure attitudes towards different groups consistently at the local level across over time, it's not something that you can easily do, which is why we focus on the white majority population here. But ideally, there would be another setup where we could examine the same question. There's another great question in the chat. Do any of your data speak to the group rank effect on other kinds of systemic inequities like employment, arrest, and incarceration rates? I think this is really excellent. So it's not something that we have in our data right now. But I can think of it as an extension that would be extremely interesting to study. So examine group location specific outcomes as a function of group rank, controlling for size. I think it's something that is feasible. One can do it with data from the US Census. To some extent, this is related to what Mina mentioned that our collaborator and I have done in a different project, where we, instead of examining measures of prejudice of the majority, we examine directly the outcomes of the minority, assimilation for immigrants in early 20th century United States in response to Black migration. I think one can think of looking at, you know, if there is this cognitive mechanism at play whereby the majority codes rank and adjusts attitudes and behaviors accordingly, a whole host of outcomes of minoritized groups could be affected. And I think that would be really interesting to study.
Awesome. Yeah, we have a couple more questions just popped up too. So the next one is, do you think there would be a consistent pattern of conduct between a rank two groups toward rank one majority or rank three minority groups? I guess the prediction would be that rank one is greater threat to rank two than rank three.
I guess the question refers to minority groups and how they see each other, or is this I'm not sure I understand it correctly.
Yeah.
Whether this would be interactions between groups depending on their relative rank, or whether this is how the majority would see groups depending on whether they're number one or number two or number three. If it is a question relating to majorities' attitudes, then I think what we see is that this effect is almost linear in that it's bigger for the first and big and still significant for the second, and then in some specifications it will not be as important for the third. Of course, this is based on the groups we haven't included in this analysis, right? If we had a different definition of groups, the effects of rank might be different. In terms of how each minority group sees other minority groups depending on relative ranks, I think that's an interesting question that is not exactly what we're studying here. It's worth thinking about, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Interminority, yes, just sorry to be clear, interminority versus minority towards majority.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a question that we've gotten is, you know, so the theory is about trying to understand how it is that, you know, if you anchor on one group, how they perceive all of the outgroups around them, which is why we anchored on white perpetrators and then looked specifically at their responses to different minority groups within the US. But you could imagine that you could almost sort of jackknife through that process where then you anchor on one particular minority and see how they respond to, let's say if we anchored on Black, how the Black population responds to white versus, but I mean, so you understand what I'm saying. You could iterate through all these possible combinations. The challenge is that there are as rare as hate crimes are, they're even more rare when they're perpetrated by minorities towards, say, whites and other minority groups. And so at some point you begin to just lose the power to be able to examine these questions. But for example, if we come back to Kevin's question, another possibility is that if we were using some other outcome variable where we weren't constrained by the sort of rarity of the event, then potentially we could do an analysis like that, and that could help us get a better sense of, is this sort of, you know, white centric in the US, or is it, you know, whoever is ranked first against second, third, and fourth, and so on.
Yeah.
And yeah, we could definitely look at that.
Yeah, I do think it's an excellent point. Now that I understand properly what you meant, you know, the same mechanism could be operating for minority members as well, and how they see other groups that are around. And as Mina said, if we had the power, we could do this for crimes against each group perpetrated by each other group and look at all the pairwise combinations. But it's exactly an issue of power. But ideally, that's what one would like to do, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So is this sort of a general thing, or is it a majority group effect? And then, oh, did you look at type of crime? Thinking on how do you account for a change in reporting of hate crime, greater awareness of it? So increased awareness, increased reporting versus share of crime, of hate crime, greater awareness of it, which might also be a reflection of the severity of the offense and or greater awareness of it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think there is some information on what the type of crime is. I'm not entirely sure, and that's potentially something that we can exploit. Reporting is generally an issue with hate crimes, and that's something that we also acknowledge in the paper, in the sense that these crimes are probably underreported in general, and the bar that the FBI sets for something to be counted as a hate crime is pretty high. There's like a two-stage process, and there's a whole host of considerations to be taken into account for saying that something is a hate crime. So it's probably undercounted. Here, we don't think, I mean, we are open to, suggestions and alternative stories to consider, but we don't think that the effect of rank is biased by differences in reporting, because that is something that should be very correlated with size. And so controlling for size should be capturing a lot of these things. And this is something that we have at the group county decade level. So there is no reason why, you may think that if a group grows larger in a particular country, you might have more reporting as the group becomes more likely to, advocate for something to be counted as a hate crime, or there could be any such process taking place. But once we account for size, there's no story that we could come up with where there would be an additional effect of rank on top of that. But we're keen to receive feedback and suggestions on that. And I think the point of looking at the type of crime and differences across types of crimes is something we can do, and see if, I'm not exactly sure how we would interpret heterogeneity across types of crimes. But I think that's feasible empirically.
Well, great. Do we have any more questions, or I think that may be all? But thank you so much, Mina and Vicky, for taking the time to speak with us today. It was amazing hearing all these answers to all your questions and your amazing presentation. And thanks to everyone who attended today. We look forward to hosting more Behavioral Insights Groups events soon. And be sure to subscribe to the BISG mailing list if you haven't already, to keep up with events. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us, and thanks for all the questions.
Yes.